Rancher and dog found abandoned VW bus in the woods. What was inside revealed a dark secret. The high plains of Laramie County have a way of holding on to things. They hold the wind in the blades of the windmills, the memory of winter in the deep draws, and the secrets of men in the unplowed earth. I've lived on this land for all my 48 years, same as my father and his father before him, and I thought I knew its every rise and fall, every whisper on the breeze. But the land is always deeper than you think, and it took my dog Max to prove it to me. It was a late Tuesday afternoon in July, the kind of day where the sun beats down with a dry, relentless heat that bleaches the color from the sky and bakes the dust into a fine red powder. We were riding the west pasture, checking the fence line along Crow Creek. Me on my steady quarter horse Dusty and Max, my Australian shepherd, trotting ahead, his blue merle coat a moving patch of storm cloud against the golden grass. Max is more than a dog, he's a partner. He can read a nervous cow from 50 yards and sense a coming thunderstorm before the clouds even gather. His instincts are as much a part of this ranch as the barbed wire and the branding iron. The creek was running low, a silver ribbon snaking through the cottonwoods that grew thick along its banks. It was quiet work, the only sounds the creak of my saddle leather, the soft plod of Dusty's hooves and the endless sigh of the Wyoming wind. We'd been at it for hours, and the sun was starting to dip toward the Laramie Range, painting the horizon in shades of orange and bruised purple. I was thinking about a cold beer and whatever my wife Sarah had on the stove for supper when Max stopped dead. He was 20 yards ahead, his body rigid, ears pricked forward. One paw was lifted, his intelligent eyes fixed on a dense copse of overgrown chokecherry and wild plum trees that we usually rode right past. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "What is it, boy?" I murmured, reining Dusty to a halt. "Coyote? A stray calf?" But it wasn't the sharp, excited bark he used for strays, nor the aggressive warning he gave to predators. This was different. It was a sound of persistent, insistent discovery. He darted toward the thicket, then looked back at me, barking once, a sharp, commanding sound that said, "You need to see this." I sighed, nudging Dusty forward. All right, I'm coming." Pushing through the branches was like entering another world. The air grew still and cool, thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. Sunlight struggled to pierce the canopy, dappling the ground in shifting patterns. And then I saw it. Tucked so deep within the trees that it seemed to have grown there, was the rusted, forgotten shell of a vehicle. It was an old Volkswagen bus, the kind you see in movies from the 60s. Its original sky blue paint faded to a chalky, peeling skin of robin's egg and rust. Creeping vines snaked over its round headlights, which stared out like clouded eyes. The tires were long gone, the rims sunk deep into the soil. It had been there for decades. How had we never seen it? This was Thompson land, had been for over 100 years. No one in my family had ever mentioned it. Max was circling the bus, sniffing intently at the passenger side door, his tail giving a few tentative wags. He looked back at me again as if to confirm I was seeing what he was seeing. I swung down from Dusty, my boots sinking into the soft ground. The silence in the thicket was profound. It felt like a church or a tomb. I tied Dusty's reins to a low-hanging branch and walked slowly toward the bus. The chrome VW emblem on the front was pitted and green with corrosion. A peace sign decal, barely visible, clung to the rear window like a ghost. This thing was a relic from another time, another world, and it was sitting on my land, a place I thought I knew better than my own face in the mirror. The handle of the sliding side door was stiff with rust, but with a hard wrench and a groan of tortured metal, it scraped open. The inside was a time capsule of abandonment. A thick layer of dust and leaves covered everything. There were faded floral curtains, a tattered sleeping bag, and a few empty cans of Campbell's soup. It was the predictable debris of a long-gone traveler, but there was something else. On the small, built-in bench seat, placed with an odd sense of purpose, sat two objects. One was a weathered, leather-bound journal, its cover warped by years of heat and cold. The other was a gray metal box, about the size of a tackle box, with a heavy-duty lock on the front. I reached in, my heart thumping a little faster than it should have. I wiped the dust from the journal's cover. There were no markings, no name. I picked up the box. It was heavy, and when I shook it, something solid shifted inside with a dull thud. It was locked up tight. Standing there in the fading light, with the scent of rust and history in my nostrils, a strange feeling washed over me. It was the feeling of a stone being overturned, revealing the damp, hidden life beneath. This bus, this journal, this box, they weren't just random junk. They were a question asked of my land, of my family, of the stories we told ourselves about who we were and where we came from. Max nudged my hand with his wet nose, whining softly. He knew it too. We hadn't just found an old vehicle. We had stumbled upon a secret, and the High Plains were finally ready to let it go. Back at the house, the smell of Sarah's beef stew filled the kitchen, a comforting anchor in the sudden strangeness of my day. She was at the sink, her back to me, but she could read my footsteps like I could read the sky. "You're late," she said without turning. "Fence take longer than you thought?" "Something like that." I set the journal and the locked box on the worn oak table. They looked alien sitting there next to the salt and pepper shakers. Sarah turned, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky, widened as she took in the dusty objects. "Jim Thompson, what in the world did you drag home now?" I told her the story, how Max had led me to the bus hidden in the creek thicket. She listened patiently, her expression shifting from curiosity to a familiar, gentle concern. Sarah was the practical one, the one whose roots in this land were planted in the here and now, not in the tangled past. "An old hippie bus?" she said, running a finger over the journal's cracked leather. "Probably some kid who broke down 40 years ago and just walked away." "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. There was a deliberate quality to how the items were left. But who leaves a locked box behind? After supper, with the dishes cleared and the quiet of a country night settling over the ranch, I sat at the table and opened the journal. Max lay at my feet, his head on his paws, watching me with an intensity that told me he knew this was important. The pages were yellow and brittle. The ink faded from black to a rusty brown. The handwriting was a tight, hurried script. There was no name, no date on the first page. Just an entry. October 12th. The wind never stops here. It scours the soul. He said to wait. He said this place was safe, hidden by the water and the trees. But I see the lights from the ranch house at night. They watch me. I know they do. I felt a chill despite the warmth of the kitchen. The ranch house. My ranch house. The entry was talking about this very spot. I kept reading. The entries were sporadic, filled with paranoia and cryptic references. October 19th. The shipment is late. CM is getting nervous. Elias promised everything would be fine, but his eyes are cold. He looks at the land like he already owns it. CM trusts him. I don't. Elias. The name hit me like a physical blow. Elias Thompson was my great-grandfather. He was the one who staked this claim, who built the original sod house with his bare hands. In our family, he was a legend, a tough, honorable man who carved a life out of this unforgiving land. CM, I didn't know who that was. I spent the next 2 hours poring over the journal. It wasn't a diary of daily life, but a record of fear. It spoke of secret nighttime meetings down by the creek, of the product being moved through the canyons, of a growing tension between this Elias and the man called CM. The writer seemed to be an outsider, a witness caught in the middle of something dangerous. The last entry was short, the handwriting shaky. November 4th. He didn't come back from the creek last night. Only Elias returned, his face like stone. He said CM ran off, took the money and headed for California. He's lying. I saw the look in his eyes. I saw the shovel in the back of his wagon. I have to get out of here, but I can't leave it. It's the only proof under the floor. He won't find it there. The entry ended there. The rest of the pages were blank. Under the floor, I whispered. I looked down at the locked metal box on my table. Sarah had been watching me from the living room doorway. "Jim, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," I said, my voice hoarse. I told her about the names, about Elias. Her brow furrowed. "Elias? Jim, it's an old story from a stranger. Your great-grandfather was a pillar of this community. He helped build the first church." "I know what they say," I said, my gaze fixed on the box. "But this feels real." The next morning I couldn't shake it. The routine of ranch work, feeding the stock, checking the wells, usually cleared my head, but today it just felt like going through the motions. The words from the journal echoed with every creak of the windmill, every lowing calf. His eyes are cold. He looks at the land like he already owns it. Max stuck close to my heels all day, as if sensing my unease. While I was patching a section of fence, he kept looking back toward the creek, whining softly. It was his way of telling me we weren't done yet. That afternoon, I drove my pickup into Laramie. The County Historical Society was housed in a stuffy brick building downtown, a place I hadn't set foot in since a school field trip in the 4th grade. Behind the counter sat Mrs. Gable, a woman whose age was as indeterminate as the dusty artifacts surrounding her. Her white hair was pinned in a tight bun, and she peered at me over a pair of reading glasses. "James Thompson," she said, her voice dry as old paper. "Don't see your kind in here often. Lose a bet?" "Something like that, Martha," I smiled. "I'm looking for some old records, homestead maps, anything you have on the original settlers in my area." I hesitated. "Specifically my great-grandfather, Elias Thompson, and a family named McGregor." Her eyes sharpened with interest. "The McGregors. Now there's a sad old story. Came out from Ohio same time as your people. Claimed the parcel just east of yours, right along the creek. Fine piece of land." She led me back into the archives, a maze of tall shelves groaning under the weight of bound ledgers and cardboard boxes. The air smelled of dust and time. She pulled down a heavy book of plat maps from the 1880s. "Here we are," she said, tracing a faded line with a bony finger. "Thompson claim, and right here, McGregor. Head of the family was a Calvin McGregor. Young fella, ambitious. He and your great-grandfather were partners at first, they say. Ran cattle together." "What happened to them?" I asked, my voice tight. "Well, that's the story, isn't it?" Mrs. Gable leaned against the shelf. "One day, Calvin McGregor just vanished, left his wife and 2 young ones. The official story, pushed by your great-grandfather, was that he'd run off with the profits from a big cattle sale. Headed west. The wife, she couldn't manage the homestead alone. After a couple of lean years, she sold the land for a pittance and moved back east with the children." "Who'd she sell it to?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "To Elias Thompson, of course," she said. "He consolidated the properties. That stretch of land along Crow Creek, the best grazing on your whole ranch, that was McGregor land. C.M. Calvin McGregor." My stomach twisted. It wasn't just a story in a journal anymore. It was written on the maps, a permanent part of my family's legacy. My ranch was built on another family's ruin. Before I left, I asked Mrs. Gable if she had any old photographs from that era. She found a box of brittle, sepia-toned portraits of Laramie County's founding families. There was one labeled Thompson and McGregor, 1888. 2 men stood side by side in front of a half-finished barn. One was undeniably a younger version of the stern-faced man in the portrait hanging in my living room, Elias Thompson. The other man was leaner, with a dark mustache and a confident, almost reckless look in his eyes. Calvin McGregor. He was holding the reins of a horse, and on his hip, tucked into his belt, was a small silver flask. The drive back to the ranch was a blur. The familiar landscape seemed different now, haunted. Every fence post, every stock tank was a testament to a history I was no longer sure of. My family's honor, the story of grit and hard work I'd been raised on, was starting to feel like a carefully constructed lie. And if it was, what did that mean for me? For my son, who I hoped would take over this ranch one day. What legacy was I really protecting? The only thing I knew for sure was that I had to get that box open. And the journal's last entry was my only clue. under the floor. I tried calling on Earl Jessup the next day. Earl was 85, sharp as a tack, and had worked as a hand on my grandfather's ranch as a boy. If anyone in the county was a living library of its unspoken histories, it was him. I found him on the porch of his small house in town, oiling a saddle that was older than I was. "Jim," he grunted, not looking up. "If you're here about that water pump, I told your boy I'd get to it next week." "It's not about the pump, Earl," I said, taking a seat on the porch rail. "I want to ask you about some old stories, about my great-grandfather, Elias." Earl stopped his work, his wrinkled hands going still. He looked at me, his pale blue eyes squinting in the bright sun. "Elias Thompson. Now there was a hard man. Built that ranch out of sheer will. What about him? Did you ever hear any talk about him and the McGregors?" A shadow passed over Earl's face. He set down his oil rag and picked up a can of chewing tobacco, packing a pinch into his cheek. He was quiet for a long time, looking out at the street. "There was talk," he said finally, his voice low. "My own granddaddy used to tell stories. Not where the women could hear, you understand. Just men after a few drinks." He spat a stream of brown juice into a coffee can by his chair. "They said Elias and Calvin McGregor weren't just running cattle. This was during the lean years, before the state came into its own. The railroad brought money, but it also brought a thirst. They said the real money was in moonshine. They had a still hidden up in the canyons, run the stuff down to the railroad camps. Dangerous business." He paused, his eyes finding mine. "The story was, they had a falling out, over money, over land. McGregor was the better distiller, but Elias held the power. He was the one with the connections. One day McGregor was just gone. Elias said he ran off, but my granddaddy said folks whispered it was something darker. Said a man doesn't just walk away from land like that. Not a man like Calvin McGregor." Earl's words hung in the air, confirming the journal's fearful scribbles. It was real. It had all been real. The moonshine runs, the betrayal, the disappearance. "Why did no one ever do anything?" I asked, the question sounding naive even to my own ears. Earl gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "Do what, son?" "Elias Thompson was a powerful man. He owned half the county by the time he was done. He was the law in his own way. And the McGregors were gone. Who was going to ask the hard questions? In those days, some secrets were safer for everyone if they stayed buried." I thanked Earl and left, his final words echoing in my mind. Safer for everyone if they stayed buried. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe I should just take the box and the journal, put them back in that rusted-out bus and walk away. Pretend I'd never found it. Protecting my family's name, my son's inheritance. Wasn't that my duty as a Thompson? But as I drove back toward the ranch, I knew I couldn't. It wasn't just about a name anymore. It was about the land itself. The soil I worked, the water my cattle drank. It was all stained with this secret. Ignoring it felt like a coward's way out. It felt like I'd be complicit in the lie, another Thompson man burying the truth to protect himself. That night, a summer storm rolled in off the mountains, the kind that makes you feel small and insignificant. The sky turned a bruised green-black, and the wind howled like a grieving animal. Rain came down in sheets, hammering against the windows. Lightning lit up the plains in stark, flashing photographs, followed by thunder that shook the very foundations of the house. I couldn't sleep. The journal and the box were on the table, calling to me. I thought of the writer, huddled in that bus, listening to a storm just like this one, terrified. And I thought of Calvin McGregor, going out to the creek on a dark night and never coming back. The storm seemed to be washing away my indecision, stripping everything down to the bone. I had to go back to the bus. I had to look under the floor. I pulled on my boots and a rain slicker. Sarah heard me at the door. "Jim, you can't be serious. Not in this weather." "I have to," I said, my voice firm. "It won't let me rest." I didn't take the horse. I took the old ranch truck, its headlights cutting a weak path through the deluge. Max, who hated thunder, didn't hesitate. He jumped into the passenger seat, his body pressed against mine, a silent, steady presence in the chaos. The track down to the creek was a river of mud. The truck fishtailed, tires spinning, but I kept it moving forward. When I reached the thicket, I killed the engine and we sat for a moment, the rain drumming on the roof, the world outside a liquid darkness. I grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight and a tire iron from the toolbox in the back. "Stay here, boy," I said to Max, but he just gave a low whine and scrambled out after me. He wasn't about to let me face this alone. The short walk to the bus was a battle against wind, rain, and grasping branches. We were soaked through in seconds. Inside the bus, the storm was a deafening roar. Water leaked through the rusted seams, dripping onto the dusty floor. In the beam of my flashlight, the small space felt claustrophobic, haunted. I remembered the journal entry. Under the floor. I swept away the debris from the thin plywood floor panels. They were swollen with damp and age. I jammed the end of the tire iron into a seam and pried. The wood splintered and moaned in protest. Underneath was just the rusted metal chassis of the bus. Nothing. I moved to the next panel, and the next. My frustration grew. Maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe the writer had taken whatever it was with them. I was about to give up when Max started acting strangely. He wasn't focused on the floor inside the bus, but on the ground outside, near the rear wheel on the passenger side. He began to dig frantically, ignoring the mud and the downpour, whining with an urgent, desperate pitch. I shone the flashlight where he was digging. The rain had washed away some of the topsoil, revealing the hard-packed earth beneath. But it wasn't just earth. I saw a straight line, an edge of something that wasn't natural. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knelt in the mud beside Max, using the tire iron to scrape away the dirt. It was a metal plate, about 2 feet square, fitted flush against the underside of the bus. A concealed compartment, accessible only from the outside. It was ingenious. No one would ever think to look there. The plate was rusted shut. I wedged the tire iron into a small gap and put all my weight on it. I grunted with the effort, my muscles screaming. The storm raged, lightning splitting the sky and illuminating the scene in a ghostly flash. With a final, agonized screech of metal, the plate gave way. I reached into the dark, muddy cavity. My fingers brushed against something small, cold, and metal. I pulled it out. It was a key, a small, ornate, old-fashioned key for the lock on the metal box. We scrambled back inside the bus, shaking and dripping. My hands were trembling as I fitted the key into the lock on the box. It turned with a satisfying, solid click. I lifted the lid. The contents weren't what I expected. There was no money, no gold. It was a box of ghosts. On top lay a small, tarnished silver flask, identical to the one I'd seen in the photograph at the Historical Society. Engraved on it were the initials C.M. Beneath the flask was a bundle of papers tied with a faded ribbon. I untied it. They were letters, love letters, written in a delicate looping script from Calvin McGregor to his wife, filled with plans for their future on the ranch, plans for their children. He was not a man preparing to abandon his family. And then there were the photographs. A small stack of them, their edges curled with age. The first two were just as I'd seen them in my mind from the journal's descriptions. One showed Elias and Calvin standing proudly in front of a hidden whiskey still, the copper gleaming in the lantern light. Another showed them shaking hands, sealing a deal. They looked like partners, like brothers. But the last photograph was different. It was taken from a distance, from a hiding place. The quality was poor, the image grainy and dark, but it was unmistakable. It showed the creek bank near a distinctive gnarled cottonwood tree I knew well. 2 figures were visible. One was on the ground. The other stood over him, holding a rifle. Even in the shadowy image, I recognized the powerful, stoic frame of my great-grandfather, Elias Thompson. And at his feet, in a patch of freshly turned earth, was a dark shape that could only be a grave. My flashlight beam trembled. casting dancing shadows across the terrible image. This was it. The proof. The secret the land had held for a century. My family's legacy, the foundation of everything I owned and everything I was built on a lie, a murder, and a stolen future. A wave of nausea washed over me. I felt the weight of that lie settle onto my own shoulders, a burden passed down through generations. Outside, the thunder cracked like a rifle shot, and I swear I could hear the ghosts of my ancestors whispering in the wind. Max pushed his head under my hand, a warm, living comfort in the cold, dead past. He had known. From the very beginning, his instincts had told him that something was terribly wrong in this place. The storm finally broke just before dawn, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet sage and ozone. I hadn't slept. I'd spent the night in the kitchen, the contents of the metal box spread out on the table like evidence in a trial. Sarah found me there when she came down to make coffee, my face pale in the gray morning light. She didn't have to ask. The look in my eyes told her everything. She sat down beside me, her hand covering mine, and we just sat in silence as the sun rose, casting long shadows across the pasture. My internal compass was shattered. One part of me, the Thompson part, screamed to bury it all again. Put the box back, burn the journal, and let the dead stay dead. The ranch was my son's future. My family's name, tarnished or not, was all we had in this community. Revealing this would unleash a whirlwind. The Hendersons, who were descended from Calvin McGregor's sister, were our neighbors. They struggled on a smaller, drier piece of land just east of the creek. We were cordial, but there was always a current of old resentment between our families, a feeling I'd never understood until now. This truth wouldn't just be a historical footnote. It would land like a lit stick of dynamite between our ranches. But another part of me, the part that looked out at this land every day and felt its spirit, knew I couldn't hide from it. The truth was as much a part of this place as the bedrock. To deny it would be to live a lie every time I saddled my horse, every time I branded a calf with the Thompson T-Bar T. That Sunday felt different. As we drove to the little white chapel in town, the same one Elias Thompson had helped build, the hypocrisy of it all was a bitter taste in my mouth. Pastor Dave gave a sermon on forgiveness and reconciliation, on how secrets fester like a wound if they're not brought into the light. It felt like he was speaking directly to me. As the congregation sang the final hymn, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't live with the silence anymore. After the service, instead of heading home for Sunday lunch, I turned the truck down the dusty road that led to the Henderson place. Sarah squeezed my hand. "Are you sure, Jim?" "I'm not sure of anything," I said honestly, "except that this is the right thing to do." Old man Henderson, whose first name was Bill but everyone just called Henderson, was sitting on his porch watching us pull up. He was a man carved from the same tough Wyoming wood as my own father, his face a roadmap of hard sun and harder years. His son Mike, a man about my own age, came out of the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Their expressions were wary. Thompsons didn't just drop by the Henderson place for a social call. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I carried the metal box with me onto the porch. "Henderson, Mike," I nodded. "I need to talk to you about something that goes way back." I told them the whole story, right from the beginning, with Max leading me to the bus. I laid out the journal, the letters, the flask. I watched their faces as the story unfolded, saw their suspicion morph into confusion, then into a dawning, painful understanding. When I finally laid the last photograph on the porch railing, the dark, terrible image of Elias standing over the grave, a heavy silence fell over us. Bill Henderson picked up the silver flask, turning it over and over in his calloused hands. His knuckles were white. "C.M.," he whispered. "Calvin McGregor, my mother's uncle." The family story was always that he was a scoundrel, that he abandoned his wife and kids and brought shame on the name. "That's the story my great-grandfather told," I said quietly. "It wasn't the truth." Mike stared at the photograph, his jaw tight with an anger that was a century old. "So your family, my family, We lost everything because your ancestor was a thief and a murderer. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and justified. Yes, I said, meeting his gaze. It appears so. I expected shouting, threats of lawyers, a final explosive break between our families. But instead, Bill Henderson just looked tired, a deep, ancient weariness settling into his bones. He looked out across his dry pasture toward the green, lush land on my side of the creek, the land that should have been his. All these years, he said, his voice thick with emotion, all these years of struggling, of wondering. My grandmother died believing her brother was a coward. The journal writer mentioned a spot, I said, my own voice unsteady, near a gnarled cottonwood on the creek bank. Max keeps going back to that same place. I think he's buried there, on my land. I took a deep breath. I think it's time we brought him home. The call to the county sheriff was the hardest I've ever made. Sheriff Brody was a good man, a friend, and he handled it with a quiet professionalism that I was grateful for. He didn't treat it like a crime scene, but like what it was, the recovery of a long-lost soul. We all went down to the creek together, me, the Hendersons, and Brody. Max trotted ahead, his purpose clear. He led us directly to the old cottonwood tree from the photograph, its bark scarred with the initials of generations of young lovers. He stopped at a place where the ground had a slight, almost imperceptible depression, and began to paw at the earth, looking back at us. No one spoke. The wind rustled the cottonwood leaves, a sound like a sad, gentle whisper. Brody and his deputy began to dig, carefully, respectfully. It didn't take long. Just a few feet down, they found what was left of Calvin McGregor. The secret was finally out, unearthed from the soil that had held it for so long. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal paperwork, quiet conversations, and the constant low hum of small-town gossip. The news spread like a grass fire. Some folks looked at me with pity, others with a newfound respect. Some of the old-timers just nodded, as if they'd known all along that the Thompson legacy had a dark root. I didn't wait for the lawyers to tell me what to do. I went to Bill Henderson with a new deed, drawn up by my own attorney. I signed over the entire original McGregor homestead, the 200 acres of prime pasture along Crow Creek, back to his family. It was a significant blow to my operation, a loss of my best grazing land. But as I watched Bill Henderson hold that piece of paper, his eyes filled with tears, I felt a sense of relief so profound it was almost dizzying. It felt like a 100-pound weight had been lifted from my soul. The land felt lighter. I felt lighter. We put Calvin McGregor to rest in the town cemetery, next to the wife who had waited for him. Most of the town turned out. It wasn't a funeral so much as a correction of history. Pastor Dave spoke about truth and how it can be painful, but it is the only thing that truly sets us free. During the service, I saw Mike Henderson look over at me from across the grave, and for the first time in my life, there was no resentment in his eyes. He just gave me a single, slow nod. An understanding. A beginning. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. It was harder, financially. We had to run a leaner operation, be smarter about our grazing rotations. But the work felt more honest. The view from my porch was different now. When I looked east toward the creek, I no longer saw just a piece of my property. I saw the Hendersons' land, their cattle grazing peacefully under the cottonwoods, and it felt right. It felt whole. One evening, a few months later, I was sitting on that same porch watching the sunset. The sky was on fire, a brilliant explosion of color. Mike Henderson's truck pulled into my driveway. He got out holding a couple of cold beers. "Thought you might be thirsty," he said, handing one to me. He sat on the steps, and for a while we just watched the sky, not saying anything. The awkwardness that had defined our families for a century was gone, replaced by a quiet, shared reality. "We found something when we were clearing out the old McGregor homestead shack," he said finally. "My great-grandmother's journal." He pulled a small, tattered book from his truck. She wrote about Elias after Calvin disappeared, how he brought them food that first winter, how he made sure they had firewood. She wrote that she didn't understand it. He was so cold, so distant, But he kept them from starving. I thought about that. About a man so consumed by greed and guilt that he commits a terrible crime, but who is still capable of a strange, tormented kind of decency. It didn't excuse what he did, not by a long shot, but it made him human. It made the story more complicated, more real. Our ancestors weren't saints or sinners carved in stone. They were just flawed people, making impossible choices in a hard land. I guess a man can be more than one thing at once, I said. Yeah, Mike said, taking a long drink of his beer. I guess he can. He told me they'd found a good spring on their new pasture, and their cattle were already looking healthier. We talked about the price of hay, the need for rain, the things ranchers have always talked about. When he left, he shook my hand. See you around, Jim. It was a simple phrase, but it felt like a peace treaty signed after a 100-year war. Max came and laid his head on my lap, his tail thumping a soft rhythm against the wooden porch. I scratched him behind the ears, looking out at the land that was mine, truly mine now, its history acknowledged, its ghosts at peace. It was smaller, but it was stronger, because it was built on a foundation of truth. You knew, didn't you, boy? I whispered, my voice thick. You knew there was a story in that ground that needed telling. He just looked up at me with those wise, loyal eyes, as if to say it was the most obvious thing in the world. In the vast, quiet expanse of Wyoming, under a sky full of stars, I finally understood what legacy meant. It wasn't about holding on to every acre or protecting a perfect, polished version of the past. It was about owning the whole story, the good and the bad, and having the courage to make it right. And sometimes, it takes a good dog to show you where to start digging.